Cena no deserto Mojave, na Califórnia, há 5 anos.
If UFOs were a product of our imagination, fulfilling a need to feel that we're not alone in this universe, if that were the case, then we wouldn't expect to see physical evidence. But we have. The search for extraterrestrial life in many ways is a search for ourselves, for who we are, a search for our place in the cosmos. One thing is certain, something is being seen from beyond. Good evening and welcome to From Beyond. I'm Joey Travolta. There are those who say that there isn't enough evidence to warrant an investigation into the UFO phenomenon. To be honest, they simply haven't looked.
Our Earth has been observed by alien civilizations for at least the past 50 years. Throughout our history, each age in our development is characterized by an ignorance about the scope of possibilities not yet understood, that future generations may look back on with a sympathetic smile of condescension. Such is the case with UFOs. To us, they represent intangible illusions between fantasy and reality. "400 years ago, the Earth was believed to be the physical center of the universe. Nicholas Copernicus, and later Galileo, challenged that belief, suggesting that the sun was the center. And still 200 years would pass before William Herschel's stellar observations, and later Edwin Hubble's classification of galaxies, relegated our sun to a single, insignificant star among billions. Only then do we begin to imagine our place in an incomprehensibly vast cosmos. The possibility of a purely psychological explanation is ruled out. The disks do not behave in accordance with physical laws, but as though they were weightless, and show signs of intelligent guidance, such as would suggest quasi-human pilots. The officials in possession of authoritative information should not hesitate to enlighten the public as speedily and thoroughly as possible." Dr. Carl Gustav Jung, 1954.
Our post-World War history has been riddled with secrets and government cover-ups. But could an international conspiracy of this magnitude be hidden for 50 years? On July 8, 1947, the U.S. Army Air Force cordoned off an area around Roswell, New Mexico, and removed all evidence of one of the most astounding events in recorded history.
The Roswell story begins on June 26, 1947, when Kenneth Arnold reported what he had seen. The Detroit News article read, "Planes, missiles, gremlins, 1,200-mile-per-hour spots in front of flyers' eyes. Pendleton, Oregon, June 26." Army spokesman expressed skepticism today on a report of 9 mysterious objects, big as airplanes, whizzing over western Washington at 1,200 miles an hour. Kenneth Arnold, a flying Boise, Idaho businessman who reported seeing them, clung, however, to his story of the shiny, flat objects. He said each was as big as a DC-4 plane, and that he saw them racing over Washington's Cascade Mountains with a peculiar weaving motion, like the tail of a kite. An Army spokesman in Washington, D.C. commented, "As far as we know, nothing flies that fast except a V-2 rocket, which travels at about 3,500 miles an hour, and that's too fast to be seen." The spokesman said the V-2 would not resemble the objects reported by Arnold, and that no tests were being made in the area where Arnold said the objects were. Arnold described the objects as flat like a pie pan, and so shiny they reflected the sun, like a mirror. He said he was flying east at 2:59 p.m. 2 days ago toward Mount Rainier when they appeared directly in front of him. The term flying saucer was born. Then, on July the 3rd, the Washington Post ran an article that the Army was investigating mysterious flying saucers. Army investigating mysterious flying saucers, reported seen over 10 states. Chicago, July 3rd, UP. Flying saucers, mystery missiles of the sky, were coming from all directions, according to eyewitnesses today, and the U.S. Army began an investigation. Persons in 10 states, including a United States meteorologist and the Lieutenant Governor of Idaho and residents of eastern Canada, reported that they had seen flying saucers. The mysterious discs, usually reported as shiny and traveling at great speeds, first were reported 10 days ago over the Pacific Northwest. Some suggested our Army, or some other Army, was testing a secret weapon. Army officers in Washington laughed, but later began to take the reports a little seriously. The discs had been reported over Oregon, Washington, California, Kentucky, New Mexico, Idaho, Colorado, South Carolina, Ohio, Texas, and eastern Canada. The Air Research Center at Wright Field, Ohio, was looking into the reports, and all service intelligence agencies were at work on them. Army experts suggested as a bare responsibility that some civilian inventor had been making experiments of some kind, and an Army Air Force spokesman at Washington said, "If some foreign power is sending flying discs over the United States, it is our responsibility to know about it and take the proper action." Lieutenant Governor Donald S. Whitehead of Idaho said he saw strange comet-like objects in the sky on June 24th. At Denver, Henry Martin and Walter Harrod said they caught a brief glimpse of a group of bright objects flying at about 5,000 feet last night. Martin said they looked like coffee can tops. They were moving southwest, he said. State Highway Patrol Sergeant David Minery of San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge Detail reported seeing a dozen bright metal objects about the size of a football over San Francisco Bay. At Bath, South Carolina, Jack Reams reported that last week he saw a disc 12 inches in diameter, giving off a small, weird light as it whizzed through the sky. A Monterey, California woman said she saw some flying saucers today. She said they were quite rounded, but not circular, with a red glow on the edge. A United States meteorologist, E. Unger of Louisville, Kentucky, said he saw a circular object flying through the air Tuesday night. He said it was moving at 100 miles an hour and gave off an orange light. On June 28th, at 1:15 p.m., Army Air Force Lieutenant Eric Armstrong saw a formation of 5 or 6 white circular objects near Lake Mead, Nevada, flying at 285 miles per hour. June 22nd, 6 p.m., a man saw a round, polished aluminum object flying as fast as a plane. June 28th, 9:20 p.m. at Maxwell Field, Alabama. 4 Air Force officers watched a brilliantly lighted object at a great height fly in a zigzag course with great bursts of speed. June 29th, 1:15 p.m., 15 miles northeast of Las Cruces, New Mexico. 4 civilians, including C.J. Zahn, a guided missile expert, saw a disc-shaped object moving straight north at a high rate of speed. June 30th, 9:10 a.m., near Grand Canyon, Arizona, Navy flight student Lieutenant William G. McGinty saw 2 gray circular objects falling at a very high speed. July 1st, at Bakersfield, California, Richard Rankin, a veteran flyer and stunt pilot, saw flights of circular objects flying at 350 miles per hour in a loose V formation. A Bakersfield housewife saw the same formation. Then it happened. On Wednesday night, July 2nd at 9:50 p.m., Mr. and Mrs. Dan Wilmot saw an oval-shaped UFO, and William Woody and his father saw a bright arcing light with a red trail northwest of Roswell, New Mexico. Mac Brazel, a rancher, heard a loud explosion at the same time. Thursday, July 3rd, Mac Brazel and 7-year-old Dee Proctor came across some lightweight metallic debris in a pasture. He reported it to the sheriff and to the intelligence officer at Roswell Air Force Base. At first, the base got excited about the find, and the Roswell Daily Record quoted Lieutenant Warren Haught, the public relations officer at the base. The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence officer of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force Roswell Army Airfield was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers and the sheriff's office of Chavez County. The phones lit up for days at the base, and the Army sent out soldiers and collected all the debris.
Looking from the direct testimonies of members of the recovery team, Bill McDonnell has been able to reconstruct forensically the design of the spacecraft, revealing a technology of unearthly origin.
I was allowed to meet with the United States Counterintelligence Corps colonel who had been directly involved making sketches at the crash site at the time of recovery in the morning of July 5th, 1947.
What's his name?
His name is Frank Kaufman. He was probably the number 3 man in charge in regards to the Counterintelligence Corps United States Army chain of command that was at the crash site. We also had the 509th Atomic Bomb Base chain of command at the crash site. Colonel Blanchard, Major Marcel, and a number of others, including the Provost Marshal of the base, who was a key witness to the crash site because it was his job to cordon it off. After spending several hours with Colonel Kaufman and getting a baseline explanation of what the vehicle looked like, he showed me wet copies, because in those days you didn't have Xerox machines, of the original drawings that he had sent to the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. in 1947. His drawings were very much like a modern-day spy aircraft. It looked like a miniature version of the SR-71. There was a very careful introduction made to a witness who was an air intelligence officer at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 1952. This air intelligence officer had a background in cryptography and in admin, and his job was to generate and disperse documents in regards to the final stages of the reverse engineering studies that had been attempted on the vehicle in the underground nuclear bomb storage pit that is in reality the source of the original Hangar 18 legend. That nuclear bomb storage pit was completely enclosed, and it is where this small, very small vehicle was stored. This witness was able for a 3-month period in his life to crawl through the interior of the wreckage, to walk around the wreckage, to examine it in detail. What was found in the desert in 1947 looked like modern-day wave rider designs that are on the drawing boards at Boeing and at Rockwell. This was in a time when nobody had ever even theorized a shockwave rider or a shockwave surfer at high speeds, high altitudes. This thing looked like a Stingray, and it had perfect blend between its crew cabin in its little fat fuselage and its, shall we say, rounded delta wing configuration. It was all one piece. There were no seams in the skin. There were no fasteners. There were no rivets. There were no lines of delineation between subcomponents. It was all one piece from the bow to the stern and from wingtip to wingtip. In the areas where the gash was, it was peeling in layers, like layers of an onion or layers of human flesh. It had a dipole waveguide structure that traveled up to the roof, which was at the gravitational center of the vehicle, and for which on the outside of the vehicle was kind of a dome or a elongated oblong-shaped gentle blister. We found that there were 2 rearward-facing seats. There was a console that wrapped around them that morphed out of the floor, and that there was one last seat facing forward the way the 2 front seats were facing forward, but that it was recessed at a greater angle into the very rear portion of the crew cabin, from which this particular crew member's head plugged directly into the vehicle. There was a direct interface between the top of his head and that structure.
When considering the Roswell case, one basic question must be asked. If nothing out of the ordinary happened at Roswell, why the extraordinary efforts to conceal it? Why do people still fear for their lives, still afraid to talk after 50 years of silence?
The Germans during World War II built at least 5 types of things we would call flying saucers. Today, if we saw them in the sky, we would say they're UFOs. 3 of these were powered very, very mundanely by rocket or chemical engines. 2 of these types were powered probably electromagnetically. This craft had remote-controlled machine guns, which may or may not have been too effective, 2 types of machine guns. It also was scheduled to have a laser weapon. This produced the Haunebu type of saucer that we would call a flying saucer, or a UFO today would be easily recognizable by any of us. After the war, by the way, these craft weren't that great as weapons for a couple of reasons. You couldn't steady them because of the magnetic field these things would generate. They would tend to wobble a little bit, like, you know, unsteady, kind of like a cork bobbing in water. The Germans maintain that Adamski took great pictures of Haunebus. I'm sure we had various models of German saucers. Certainly the conventionally powered saucers we had rebuilt by that time. We're not talking very complicated. We're just talking about a lot of work putting things together, like building a house. It's not complicated. You just have to do the work. The electromagnetic ones were certainly more complicated, but were seen in the area in probably 50 or 51, certainly by a great number of people. So they were around then in the very early 50s, if not the late 40s.
A bird watcher walking in the woods on the 23rd of April 1950 was crashing through the underbrush, and he emerged into a clear area not far from Redbud, Illinois, facing the southwest. He came into a clearing from the south side, and as he stepped into the open area, he saw a large object hovering just over the scrub bushes there. Now, this was about 30 or 40 feet in diameter, and it was less than 100 feet high. It was below the tops of the trees. The first picture was a good, sharp, clear picture. And he turned it over to the local newspaper, and it was published on the paper. And a few days later, he was contacted by a newsboy who was throwing papers that time of day down the road in a rural area. And the newsboy said that he saw the object coming from the direction of the woods, heading down the highway at about 4 times, 5 times the speed of an airplane. And he looked up at it and saw it, and down the road a little ways, he came on a man and his wife working on the roof repairing it, and he said, "Did you see the thing that just went over?" And they said yes, they had watched it also. So there were other observers that corroborated Dean Martin's story, and they came out in news reports the following day. So that was an interesting sighting because it represented a type seen rather close up and photographed within 100, 150 feet, 200 feet of the camera. The next one that got any real attention occurred on the 11th of May of 1952 at McMinnville, Oregon, at about 7:30 in the early evening of 11 May 1952. Farmer Paul Trent was in the kitchen of his home when he heard his wife, who called to him from the backyard to come out and see the strange object that was approaching. And he immediately ran for his folding camera and dashed outside to meet her. There against the low overcast sky, he saw a circular dome disc with a tower on top of the dome, a raised cupola. It was moving fairly slow. He had plenty of time to frame it. He snapped the first picture, and then he had to move to his right to snap the second picture. There was no flame or efflux of any kind visible, no sound. It was completely silent. His wife didn't hear any sounds either. The pictures he took on the 11th of May, and he didn't report them until the 12th of June, when he had his pictures developed and back, and he showed them to a friend, Frank Wortman, who suggested they take him to the newspaper, and they took him to the Richmond, California Independent, where they looked at them, tested them, and published them for the first time. So now it's 2 months after the pictures were taken before the information got out. But they have become a classic in the lore of UFOlogy, I guess if you want to call it.
Dozens of remarkable UFO photographs were taken in the early 1950s by George Adamski through a telescope near Mount Palomar, California. To this day, Mr. Adamski remains a controversial figure because he claims to have been in contact with the occupants of the craft.
During those 63 to 65, we were involved with Mr. Adamski personally during those times, I really had an opportunity to see some of these crafts exceedingly close. And these are impressions that never leave my thinking because they were so deeply rooted. And to go to these lectures in which you had literally lines of scientists and military officials sitting there and people listening intently on the information that was exchanged and given, it was a very dynamic time in this field, which certainly has changed in the last 20 years. My father had numerous sightings, and due to these sightings, he got in contact with many different agencies of the government and investigated heavily into others who had reports of UFO encounters and taken pictures of these type of craft. And because of this investigation, he got in contact with Mr. George Adamski, who was in many respects a pioneer in this field already back into the late 40s and early 50s. I've been taking a large number of telescopic pictures and had motion picture footage of these crafts, and even had many controversial contacts during these times. And this is really the basis of how I became involved through my lifetime, through my father, and through Mr. George Adamski. In this particular shot, we have a picture of a cigar-shaped craft with its propulsion system fully operational, so it looks like it's enveloped in a luminescent shield of fluctuating light. And it's located between the Earth and the Moon. It was taken by a 6-inch telescope Mr. Adamski took in the late 1940s. And this craft can be in dimension anywhere from 1,000 feet to several miles in length. And this craft here is the same type of craft as you see in the picture above, but you can see the outline of the hull itself. And this is in orbit in the Earth's atmosphere. And here is another craft around the moon, and you can see it's trailing behind it the several other craft in sequence as it's around lunar orbit.
In early March of 1951, through his 6-inch telescope, George Adamski was able to photograph a remarkable series of 4 photos as the large carrier-type craft was releasing 6 scout craft.
And basically this craft is what we would call a miniature city. It is in an environment that is enclosed to itself, and these bell-shaped craft, like our aircraft on an aircraft carrier, are housed in this cigar-shaped craft. And so this is used for distance travel through long distances of space.
Quando ele nasceu,
What we have here is a picture of the bell-shaped, the scout-shaped craft with the 3-ball condensers underneath it. The condensers are a means in which the polarity, the electromagnetic polarity, can be shifted direction, and it's set up triangularly, so by shifting polarity from this angle to this angle, the craft maneuvers in a 3-dimensional field. And around the outside of the cabin area, there are 3 sets of 4 portholes, or 12, and that is common to all the scout crafts that have been photographed anywhere in the world, whether they're Adamski photographs or not. These craft operate on what we would call a pro-gravity field. They do not believe in fighting the principles and the forces of nature, because they're far too strong. What they do is they believe in blending harmoniously in with those forces. And it's very much like you can jump against an ocean current and swim and expand a lot of energy, or you can turn around and let it carry you where it's going. And they follow the currents of electromagnetic energy through space from planet for planet. And this is how they operate.
We had some suspicions about what the U.S. government had been doing for a number of years, based on the research of all the ufologists that came before me, and journalists and investigators, that the U.S. government had conducted secret studies, that it was serious about the UFO problem behind the scenes while it was dismissing it in public, that it had spied on UFO researchers and infiltrated UFO organizations and lied about what it knew about the problem and spread disinformation.
Public interest in the last few years has centered on a phenomenon which has been identified as flying saucers. This phenomenon has led to many stories. Much fact, much fiction, little fact. Oh, isn't that camera? Public interest in the last few years has increased very greatly in a phenomenon which has been identified as flying saucers. These stories have led to much fiction and much fancy. I would like to separate a few facts from some of the fiction that has been traveling around across the country. These myths will continue for months or even years to come. For the last 4 years, the Navy has had a project in the study of cosmic rays which has lent some fact to these stories.
Inflating an immense balloon aboard the USS Norton Sound, the Navy prepares for further study of the elusive cosmic rays somewhere in the Pacific. That's the news. A secondary consideration clears up the mystery of the so-called flying saucers. For it is these monsters which rise 19 miles and attain diameters of 100 feet that have been mistaken for the apparitions called flying saucers. At great altitudes, they tell us, these elongated enormities flatten out like plates. Mystery ended.
And if the U.S. government had gone to such lengths, it seemed only reasonable that perhaps the USSR, the world's other superpower, may have done the same thing. So we saw a window of opportunity, go to the USSR or go to Russia, dig up what they've got, and maybe we'd end up learning more about what America knows about UFOs from the Russians than we'd ever learn from the Americans.
We've been able to explain them as hoaxes, as erroneously identified friendly aircraft, as meteorological or electronic phenomena, or as light aberrations.
The most important person that we met was probably Colonel Boris Sokolov, who for 10 years commanded a nationwide, unprecedented UFO study. In his words, the Ministry of Defense order that had come down commanding all units in this vast Soviet military empire to cooperate with the study, in essence turned the USSR into one gigantic UFO listening post. It's a study of unprecedented size and scope, and one that could probably never be duplicated again since the USSR doesn't exist. Over that 10-year period, thousands and thousands and thousands of reports came pouring into Sokolov's office. 90 to 95% could be explained as conventional objects, rocket tests, missile tests, planes, planets, weather balloons, things of that nature. But Sokolov says there remains a core of cases, much like here in the U.S., a core of cases that could not be explained away. Those cases were studied by the Ministry of Defense for the specific purpose of trying to get a leg up on the United States in stealth technology. Sokolov said that the Russians could recognize that UFOs could do things we could not do. They appear on radar, but not visually, appear visually, but not on radar, appear, disappear, merge into one, split into two, take off at incredible speeds, perform incredible maneuvers. If they could duplicate that technology by studying UFOs, they would win the battle for stealth technology. So it was a very practical reason for their study.
However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things.
When the private investigators, the UFO investigators in Brussels, went to the military officials, the officials were ready and willing and able to cooperate. And if we can find this level of cooperation in Belgium, we should be able to find this level of cooperation in America. This case involved photographs, it involved radar, it involved military jet intercepts, and a highly credible analysis, photographic analysis of a 35mm photograph that was taken from the ground, a nighttime shot, of what appears to be a triangular airform with very bright lights, one at each corner of the triangle, and then a orange-red light pretty much at the center of the object as well. 2 books have been published by the UFO group in Belgium, in Brussels, documenting a great deal of the evidence, including eyewitness drawings and photographs and so forth, other evidence. This object was tracked at very high speed by the official military authorities, the Air Force. As a matter of fact, one of the leading Air Force officers at the time acknowledged that he could not explain what this phenomenon was. It remains unidentified. So once again, we have a foreign case, highly credible witnesses, photographic evidence, radar evidence, visual evidence, all correlating to the same space and time. I don't know what more evidence a scientist would want to take a look at. And to claim that there's no there's no physical evidence is just, that's not true.
Since the beginning of the UFO phenomenon, almost 50 years ago, flying saucers, if they are believed to exist at all, have been thought to originate from an extraterrestrial source. But there is a growing body of evidence that offers a more earthly explanation.
Dr. Richard Haynes is a physiological psychologist who has conducted numerous research and development projects for NASA Ames Research Center in San Jose, California. One such project was the design of the Proximity Operations Research Mock-up, a spacecraft docking simulator, which will eventually assist Space Station Freedom astronauts in the docking of visiting spacecraft. Dr. Haynes' interest in the UFO phenomenon began some 30 years ago. Since then, he has published several books on the subject, most recently, Project Delta, a study of multiple UFO sightings.
Over the years of looking at this phenomenon, I have studied quite a few photographs which just cannot be explained by prosaic explanations. And the reason why they can't be explained so readily is, again, where they were taken and when they were taken and the conditions under which they were taken. That's as important as the shape of the object that's seen. So, for instance, Jacques Vallée and I have analyzed a very interesting photograph from Costa Rica, taken from an airplane, looking straight down. The airplane was at 10,000 feet altitude, and the background of this object is a lake. And so the object, or whatever it is hovering over the surface of a lake. And by knowing the optics of the camera, the focal length, and so forth, we know the angular width of the object. We know its absolute distance. It can't be more than 10,000 feet. So we were able to calculate the size of this object. And what we find, based upon our analyses, is, I think, clearly a three-dimensional object, not a flat or two-plane object, with some very interesting symmetry in the surface structure, or the surface reflections, let's call it. In addition to that, I find two edges which are very smooth and continuous and parallel to each other, which think of a penny kind of seen at an angle. The two sides of the edges are rather smooth, relative, and parallel to each other. On the other hand, at the far side, I find a very undulating and irregular edge, which is very intriguing. It raises some interesting questions, and it suggests that the object, whatever it is, may possibly be submerged into the water. This actually may represent the wave border or boundary, as the object is at an angle to the water surface. The object is anomalous in that case, first of all, because there is no known, no visible means of propulsion or lift in this case. The second case, the second point is that we have a photograph taken 20 seconds before it and 20 seconds after it by an automatic camera with nobody looking at the camera. It's just doing its own exposures automatically. The object is not visible in the previous or the following, which tells us something that the object had to be appearing within that 20-second period and then disappearing after it. Well, that's anomalous. Airplanes don't do that. So we were able to calculate that if the object entered linearly and flew across the camera field of view, how fast would it have to travel in order to show up just in the middle frame? And the answer is in almost 1,000 miles an hour. The object had to be very big if it was far away, and on the order of 800 to 1,000 feet across, which makes it anomalous. Another explanation would be that it's a smaller object closer to the airplane. Nobody on board the airplane saw this. It was about 5 men on board the airplane doing a routine mapping. Well, that's just one example of a disc-shaped, three-dimensional object reflecting sunlight realistically following the laws of optics and reflection, let's say, where the object just cannot be explained as an airplane or a kite or a frisbee or some model of some sort or a balloon or many ors. And after exploring all these options and doing the analysis, we're left with a UFO, an unidentified flying object.
Recently, some incredible footage was recorded during the shuttle mission STS-48. NASA claims the objects you will see are particles of ice floating in space, but scientific study shows that these objects are intelligently controlled spacecraft with capabilities far beyond ours.
T-minus 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7. Go for main engine start. 3 main engines up and burning. 3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery on the Upper Atmosphere Research Satellite, beginning a new era studying the Earth's environment from space.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Mission Control Houston now controlling the flight of Discovery.
On September 15, 1991, the Space Shuttle Discovery captured on videotape several anomalous objects moving in unusual trajectories. 4 NASA scientists were asked to look at the footage, concluding, the objects seen are orbiter-generated debris, illuminated by the sun. The flicker of light is the result of firing of the attitude thrusters on the orbiter, and the abrupt motions of the particles result from the impact of gas jets from the thrusters. To illustrate the sequence of events, the flash is the thruster firing. The abrupt change in direction of the particles are a result of the gas jet which accelerates the debris. Dr. Jack Kasher, a physicist at the University of Nebraska, has recently completed an exhaustive analysis of the event.
What I'm going to tell you is the result of my analysis as a physicist and a scientist, just taking the data and seeing where it goes. And the bottom line of my investigation is I started out my investigation assuming that there were ice particles and trying along the way to prove that there were ice particles. And I found out that at least if you take the data that I've got and the analysis that I've gotten, that I've done of it, that's a completely untenable position. The camera was focused at infinity, and any little specks would just be invisible. And you can tell that's true because toward the end of the segment, the camera pans down and looks at the side of the cargo bay, and you can see it's grossly out of focus. Then it focuses and then turns toward the front. So it was focused at infinity, so any little particles near the camera don't work. Ice particles don't work. And after that, there aren't many options. Meteors, absolutely not. They don't change direction. And space junk, satellites don't change direction. There are no other options. These are objects that are clearly at times above the air glow, and so they're maneuvering, and they are in outer space. Therefore, they're spacecraft. I don't see any other interpretation that you can have. They are some kind of spacecraft.
Here is the camera view from the shuttle just prior to the event. What appears to be the horizon is actually the top of the Earth's air glow. The Earth's physical horizon is located about 60 miles below the top of the air glow. Here you see the changes of direction of several of the objects after the flash. The main object will appear moving to the left, followed shortly by a flash, at which time the objects abruptly change direction, followed by 2 streaks. This is a close-up of the same sequence, screen right, showing several objects at the time of the flash. Note the regular pulsations of the objects, which is inconsistent with tumbling ice particles. Shortly after, the camera pans down to the shuttle bay. The jerkiness is a result of the camera movement. Note this object, when silhouetted, appears to have the shape of a domed disc. Later in the mission, this object shot through the upper corner of the frame. Enlarged and slowed down, it also appears to be disc-shaped with a regular pulsation.
Once again, my analysis is a scientific one that at least satisfies me that those objects were not ice particles. And beyond that, we're all in the same boat together because we're speculating, and I have no evidence to prove what one was or the other, or whether one explanation works or the other, but it opens up the door, it opens up the can of worms to discussing some of these questions.
No single piece of evidence is conclusive, but it can provide a clue. The challenge is to keep an open mind.
E agora, Mundo convida você a percorrer o túnel do tempo.
Bem-vindos a ontem.